The first time someone warned Edward Cavendish about Eleanor Voss, he was eating a perfectly good piece of roast beef and had no desire to hear anything that would ruin it. His mother said the name the way she said most things she disapproved of, quietly, with enormous precision, the way a doctor names a disease in front of the patient. "Eleanor Voss," she said, setting down her fork. Edward kept eating. "You have heard of her." "I have not," he said, which was true. He was 31 years old, a duke by inheritance rather than ambition, and he had spent the better part of the last 2 years in Edinburgh managing a state business that nobody else wanted to manage. The social geography of London had shifted in his absence. Entire new populations of gossip had risen and fallen without his awareness, and he had not particularly minded. "She is the Voss girl," his mother said, as though this explained everything. "Arthur Voss's youngest daughter. The difficult one." "How many daughters does Arthur Voss have?" "3. The other 2 are fine." Edward looked up from his plate. His mother was watching him with the expression she reserved for conversations she had been rehearsing. "Why are we discussing Arthur Voss's daughters?" he asked. "Because you are back in London," she said, "and you will meet people. And I want you to understand, before you meet certain people, who they are. And who is Eleanor Voss?" His mother picked up her fork again. She arranged a small piece of carrot on it with great attention. "She is not," she said carefully, "the kind of woman a man recovers from." Edward finished his roast beef. He poured himself more wine. He thought about Edinburgh, about ledgers and stone walls, and the particular silence of the Highlands at 5 in the morning, and he said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to a sentence like that. He filed the name away in the part of his mind he used for things he did not yet understand. He had not met her yet. That part came later. Everything important came later. London in the spring of 1889 was a city performing itself. Everyone was dressed for the performance. Everyone had lines. The parks were full of people who had decided that being seen in the park was the afternoon's primary purpose, and the clubs were full of men who had decided that the primary purpose of an afternoon was to sit in a leather chair and have opinions about things they would not personally be affected by. Edward returned to all of it the way you return to a childhood home after years away, recognizing the furniture, slightly surprised that it still exists, slightly unsure where you belong inside it. He attended the necessary dinners. He nodded at the necessary people. He made the small talk that is required of a man in his position, which is not really talk at all, but a kind of agreed-upon noise, a social hum that keeps the evening moving without anyone having to say anything they actually mean. He was good at it. He had been raised to be good at it. His father had been good at it before him, and his grandfather before that, and the Cavendish line stretched back far enough that being good at it felt less like a skill and more like a feature of the blood. But he was bored. He had always been a little bored by it, even before Edinburgh. Edinburgh had simply made the boredom more visible to him, the way stepping outside makes you aware that the room you were in was stuffy. It was at the Harrington garden party, in the 3rd week of his return, that he first saw her. He almost didn't. The garden was crowded in the specific way that fashionable events are crowded. Everyone packed together, everyone pretending there is space, and he had been standing near the roses trying to finish a conversation with Lord Pemberton about interest rates, which was not the worst conversation he had ever had, but was close. She was standing about 15 feet away, near the hedge, talking to a woman he didn't recognize, and she was laughing. This sounds like a small thing. People laugh at garden parties constantly. But there are different kinds of laughing. There is the kind of laughing that is performed for the room, that says, "Look at me, I am enjoying myself. Isn't this wonderful?" And there is the kind of laughing that a person cannot help, That happens because something is genuinely funny, and the body responds before the social training can intervene. She was doing the second kind. Her whole face was doing it. She was holding a glass of lemonade and she was laughing like she had completely forgotten where she was. And the woman next to her was laughing too, and neither of them seemed remotely concerned about who was watching. Lord Pemberton said something about the Bank of England. Edward said, "Yes, quite," in the appropriate tone. He did not look away from the woman near the hedge. She had dark hair and a way of holding herself that was not precisely straight, but was entirely deliberate. Like someone who had been told to stand up straight so many times that she had decided to find her own version of it. She was not small. She took up exactly the amount of space her body required and seemed to have no interest in taking up less. He watched her for about 30 seconds before he realized he was doing it, and another 10 before he decided he didn't mind. "Cavendish?" Lord Pemberton said. "Forgive me," Edward said. "I was distracted." He went back to the conversation about interest rates. He did not seek her out that afternoon. He told himself this was because there were other people he needed to speak with, which was true. He told himself it had nothing to do with the warning his mother had given him at dinner 3 weeks earlier. That was less true. He learned things about her the way you learn things in London, which is to say without asking and without wanting to, through the medium of other people's conversations at other people's tables. She was 27 years old. She had been, according to various sources, engaged once, to a man named Clifton, a solicitor from a respectable family, and the engagement had ended 8 months before the wedding, and the details of why were disputed. Some said she had ended it. Some said he had. Most agreed she had said something at a dinner party that had made the whole enterprise impossible, though what she had said depended entirely on who was telling the story. She had spent a year in Florence after the engagement ended, which certain people found suspicious and other people found admirable, and most people found interesting, which in the social economy of London was its own kind of currency. She had opinions. This was mentioned frequently and with a particular emphasis, as though opinions were a condition she suffered from rather than a thing she had chosen. She spoke them aloud in rooms where women were not expected to speak aloud anything more substantial than agreement. She had argued with Lord Ashworth at a dinner in February about the rights of factory workers, and Lord Ashworth had turned quite red and said something dismissive, and she had simply continued her point without raising her voice, which everyone agreed was somehow worse than if she had shouted. Considerably, and not only novels. She read philosophy and history and economics, and when she had read something she disagreed with, she wrote in the margins of the book, which her older sister considered practically criminal. She was, in the established vocabulary of London society, a problem. A bright, warm, laughing, impossible problem that most sensible families had quietly decided was not worth the disruption. Edward listened to all of this over the course of several dinners, and one afternoon at his club, where a man named Whitmore had apparently decided to give him the comprehensive version. "She's a lovely girl," Whitmore said, in a tone that strongly implied this was not the point. "But she's not easy, you understand. Not easy in the way that she has views, and she'll tell you them." "Terrible," Edward said. Whitmore looked at him. "I'm serious, Cavendish." "I'm sure you are. Her father despairs of her." "That seems like Arthur Voss's problem," Edward said. Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it, and went back to his drink, apparently deciding that Edward was being deliberately difficult, which was not entirely wrong. What Edward did not say, to Whitmore or to anyone at that dinner or at any of the dinners that followed, was that everything he was being told about Eleanor Voss was making her more interesting rather than less. He recognized this as possibly irrational. He also recognized it as true. He wanted to meet her, not because she was a problem, because she didn't seem to be trying to be one. Everything he was hearing suggested a woman who was simply being herself, with great consistency and without apology, and the people around her had labeled that a problem because it was easier than examining why it disturbed them so much. He wanted to talk to someone who said what she meant. He had spent 31 years in rooms where almost nobody did. They met at the Cresswell lecture. This was not a fashionable event. It was a Thursday afternoon lecture at the Royal Institute on the economic effects of urban migration, and it was attended primarily by academics and civil servants and several journalists, and, as it turned out, Eleanor Voss. Edward was there because the topic genuinely interested him, and because his friend Marcus, who worked for the Home Office, had suggested it, and promised him the speaker was worth hearing. He did not expect to see her. He recognized her from across the room before he had consciously identified why. That quality of taking up her own space, the dark hair, the way she was leaning forward in her chair before the lecture had even begun, reading the printed program with the concentration of someone who intended to have thoughts about it. She was sitting 2 rows ahead of him and 1 seat to the left. He could see her profile. The lecture began. It was, as promised, excellent. The speaker was a Professor Whitfield from Cambridge, who had spent 4 years researching migration patterns in Manchester and Birmingham, and had numbers and evidence and arguments that were genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who had benefited from the existing economic order, which included most of the people in the room. Edward watched her listen. This is not as strange as it sounds. Listening is not passive. Some people listen with their whole body, leaning forward, nodding, occasionally shaking their head slightly when they disagree with something. She listened this way. He could tell when Whitfield said something she found compelling, and when he said something that made her skeptical, just from the set of her shoulders. After the lecture there was tea. This was the part where people drifted into small clusters and either discussed what they had just heard or did not, depending on their temperament. He found himself moving toward the table where the tea was being served at approximately the same time she was, and they arrived at it together, and she reached past him to take a cup before she registered who was beside her. She looked up. Brown eyes, darker than he'd expected. An expression that was evaluating him with the same directness she had applied to the lecture program. "The last argument," she said, without introduction. "Do you think he proved it?" It took Edward a half-second to understand that she was asking him about the lecture. Which argument? That the current poor law creates a disincentive to urban migration that benefits landowners at the expense of the working poor. Did he prove it? Or did he simply assert it very confidently? Edward thought about this. Actually thought about it, rather than performing thinking about it. He had the numbers from Manchester, he said. But he applied them to Birmingham without sufficient evidence that the conditions were comparable. So I'd say, partially proved. The premise was sound, but the extrapolation was quick. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Exactly. And then, I'm Eleanor Voss. Edward Cavendish." She took her tea. He took his. They stood near the table and talked for 40 minutes about Professor Whitfield's argument, about the poor law, about what she had read on the subject and what he had read, about Edinburgh, which she found interesting, about Florence, which he found interesting, about a book they had both read and disagreed about in precisely opposite directions, and then, after another 20 minutes, discovered they had actually read quite differently and disagreed about less than they thought. She was direct. She said what she thought. When she disagreed with something he said, she told him why. And the reasons were specific and informed and occasionally infuriating in the best possible way. When he made a point, she found convincing she said so without making a performance of it. Just, yes, I hadn't considered it that way, and moved on. He felt, for the first time in longer than he could comfortably measure, genuinely awake. He walked back to his club afterward through the mild April evening and thought about the conversation, replaying sections of it, recalling specific sentences she had said, and did not arrive at his destination for almost twice the time it should have taken because he had missed 2 turns. He stood outside the club door for a moment. He thought, I need to be careful. He went inside, sat down, ordered a whiskey, and was not careful at all. He saw her again the following week at the Morrison dinner, then at the Ashworth reception, which he had almost skipped. Then at a small afternoon gathering at the Whitfields' home, the professor and his wife, it turned out, hosted a salon on the 2nd Tuesday of each month that Eleanor attended regularly, and that Edward, after being mentioned it by Marcus, began attending as well. He told himself it was because the discussions were excellent, which they were. He told himself it was because the company was stimulating, which it was. He did not spend very much time examining the precision with which he arranged himself to be in whatever room she happened to be in. They talked at every event, more than was strictly appropriate for 2 people who had only recently met, more than was strictly appropriate for a duke and a woman with the specific reputation Eleanor Voss had acquired. Edward noticed people noticing this. He found that he did not particularly care, which itself was a kind of data. He learned her in pieces. The way you learn a city you are beginning to love. First the main streets, then the details, then the strange and unexpected things that make it impossible to stop walking. She was funny, sharply, quietly funny, in a way that didn't announce itself. She would say something perfectly ordinary, and then something else that arrived at the end of the ordinary thing, like a door opening onto an unexpected view, and the humor was in the gap between the 2 things, and if you weren't paying attention you would miss it entirely. She was also serious. She cared about things with her whole self. Factory conditions, children's education, the specific circumstances of people who lived 2 streets over from the comfortable houses where London's comfortable people had their dinners and their lectures and their salons and their opinions. She didn't care about these things as a fashion or a talking point. She had been to Manchester. She had seen things she could not unfeel. She was afraid of nothing as far as he could tell, or rather, she was afraid of things, she had told him once, late at an evening at the Whitfields when most of the other guests had gone. But fear had never struck her as a sufficient reason not to do something. What things are you afraid of? He had asked. She had thought about it honestly. That I will mistake comfort for contentment, she said. That I will choose the safe thing so many times that I stop noticing it's a choice. He had thought about that sentence for 3 days afterward. He was afraid of some version of the same thing. He had not known this until she said it. He had thought what he felt was boredom. He understood now that boredom was just what it felt like from the outside. They argued about politics and books and money and agriculture and the appropriate role of the aristocracy in a changing England. And he found that arguing with her was the best use of his mind he had found in years. She did not flatter him. She did not soften her points to make him comfortable. She treated him as an equal in a conversation, which sounds simple, but is actually, in his experience, vanishingly rare. She also made him laugh. Not the performed laugh, not the social noise, the actual, helpless kind. She would say something in the middle of a perfectly serious discussion that would make the whole edifice tilt sideways and suddenly become funny, and he would laugh before he could help it. And she would smile, not a triumphant smile, just a pleased one. the smile of someone who was glad the joke had landed, and they would both come back to the serious topic afterward, and somehow the serious topic was better for it. He began to understand that this was what she was. Not a problem, not a disruption, not a difficult woman in the vocabulary of people who found anything difficult that wouldn't hold still and be convenient. She was simply very much herself, with a completeness and a consistency that most people found either admirable or uncomfortable, depending on whether it threatened them. She threatened comfortable arrangements. He had stopped finding comfortable arrangements comfortable about 3 weeks before he met her, and so she did not threaten him at all. She interested him. More and more, and then more than that. He asked her if she would take a walk with him in the park on a Saturday morning in May. This was not entirely appropriate without a chaperone, but they were both adults, and he thought she would find the formality of arranging a chaperone faintly absurd, and he was right, because she said, yes, Saturday, 10 o'clock, without any apparent concern for the question of chaperones. It was a good morning, clear sky, new leaves on the trees, the park not yet crowded. They walked and talked, and at one point she pointed out a pair of birds he did not recognize and named them with the confidence of someone who had simply decided to know about birds at some point and had followed through on it. He told her about his father. This surprised him. He did not usually talk about his father, but she asked a question, something about whether he had chosen to manage the Edinburgh estate himself or inherited the obligation. And the honest answer required talking about his father, who had died when Edward was 23 and had left behind a financial situation that was less stable than it appeared from the outside, and a son who had to quietly spend several years making it stable again without making it visible. She listened. She did not fill his sentences for him or rush him toward a conclusion. She listened the way she listened at lectures, with her whole self, leaning in slightly, attending. That must have been isolating, she said when he finished, to be carrying something that large and not be able to talk about it. Yes, he said. It was. He had never said that to anyone. He hadn't known he needed to. She told him about Florence, about the year she had spent there after the engagement ended, and here she was direct about it. She said, after the engagement ended, without euphemism or visible pain, though he sensed the pain was there somewhere, covered with the same practicality she applied to most things. In Florence she had learned Italian, badly at first and then well. She had spent time with a group of artists who were doing things with paint that she didn't fully understand, but that had made her understand that not understanding something was not a reason to stay away from it. She had read a great deal. She had walked a great deal. She had learned what it felt like to be alone in a place where nobody knew her name, and had discovered, to her own surprise, that she had liked it. I had been managed, she said, choosing the word carefully, for a long time, by my family, by the engagement, by all the expectations of what an Arthur Voss daughter ought to be. In Florence, there was nobody to manage me. It was the first time I found out what I actually was, underneath the management. And what were you? She considered this. A cart went by on the path behind them. Some children were shouting somewhere across the grass. Myself, she said, which sounds simple and is not. No, he agreed. It is not. They walked back in a comfortable silence that was not empty. He had walked in comfortable silences with people before, but this one had a different quality. It was the silence of two people who had said real things and were letting them settle, not the silence of two people who had run out of things to perform. At the park gate he said goodbye and watched her walk away toward the street. And he stood there for longer than was necessary, watching, and then he walked in the opposite direction and thought, I am in considerable trouble. He was not unhappy about this. That was the interesting part. He was in considerable trouble, and he was not unhappy about it even slightly, which told him something he had already suspected but had not yet been willing to write down. His mother asked him to come to tea in the second week of June. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that when he arrived, his aunt was also there, and his cousin James, and after a short time spent on pleasantries, his mother said, with the precision of someone who has been rehearsing, "We are concerned about Eleanor Voss." Edward accepted a cup of tea. He put 1 lump of sugar in it, which was his usual amount. He stirred it. "Are you?" he said. "People are talking," his aunt said. She was a small woman with a large capacity for worry. "You are seen with her constantly. At the Morrison dinner, at the Whitfield salon, in the park." "In the park, Edward, without any—" "She is an adult woman," Edward said pleasantly. "That is not the point." "What is the point?" His mother set down her cup with a small, definitive click. "The point is that Eleanor Voss has a reputation that will become your reputation if you continue to spend time with her in the way you have been spending time with her. She is not received everywhere. She has made enemies among people we cannot afford to make enemies of, and she is not." A pause, careful and chosen. "Appropriate." "Appropriate for what?" Edward asked. "For a man in your position." "And what is my position?" His mother looked at him steadily. "You are the Duke of Cavendish," she said. "You have a title that is 8 generations old. You have estates and tenants and responsibilities that extend beyond your personal preferences. You have a name." "I am aware of my name," Edward said. "Then you understand what I am saying." "I understand what you are saying," Edward said. "I am not sure I agree with the conclusion." His cousin James, who had been quiet until this point, leaned forward. James was a good man. Edward liked him. He was also anxious in the way that people are anxious when they have benefited greatly from an established order, and are afraid of anything that might disturb it. "Cavendish," he said, "I am only going to say this because I care about you. She is not suitable. She is intelligent, I'm sure, and whatever else, but she is the kind of woman who makes a man's life complicated. Her first engagement ended badly. She has alienated half the drawing rooms in London. Her views are, she is not going to be easy to manage." Edward looked at his cousin. "I do not want to manage her," he said. A silence settled over the room. His mother, his aunt, his cousin, all held expressions of varying degrees of dismay. "I want to talk to her," he said. "I want to disagree with her and have her disagree with me. I want to laugh at things with her. I want to hear what she thinks about the poor law and what she read last week, and what she saw in Florence, and what she is afraid of." He paused. "I am not particularly interested in whether this is convenient for the drawing rooms." He finished his tea. He set the cup down. "I appreciate your concern," he said. "I understand that it comes from genuine care for me, and I don't dismiss it." He looked at his mother, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Dismay, yes, but something else underneath it. Something that might have been the beginning of resignation, or possibly the beginning of admiration. It was hard to tell with her. "But I am 31 years old. I have managed the estate and the finances and everything else that was required of me since I was 23. I would like, at this point, to be trusted to manage my own life." He stood. He said goodbye. He walked out. On the pavement outside his mother's house, he stood for a moment in the afternoon sun, and he felt strange. He felt the way he imagined a window might feel when it is opened after a long time being closed. Like something had gotten out. Or in. He wasn't sure which, and he wasn't sure it mattered. He walked to the Whitfield salon, which was happening that afternoon, And Eleanor was there, and they argued about Gladstone for 40 minutes, and it was the best 40 minutes of his week. There were more warnings after that. They came from different directions with different specific concerns, but the same essential structure. She is not what you need. She is not what the name requires. You will regret this. His uncle, at the club, with a generosity that was entirely sincere and entirely misapplied, spent 40 minutes on the subject of what a duke's wife needed to be, and what Eleanor Voss was not. She's had a broken engagement, his uncle said. That's not. Look, in the world we live in, that matters. It's not fair, perhaps, but it matters. And her opinions, Cavendish. Her opinions are, she said something to Ashworth that apparently, Lord Ashworth, Edward said, is wrong about factory conditions and wages, and has been wrong about them for 30 years. And if someone finally told him so, at a dinner table, I am inclined to congratulate them. His uncle stared at him. She's changed you, he said, with the tone of a man identifying a disease. She hasn't changed me, Edward said. She's made me notice that I agreed with her before I met her. I simply didn't have anyone to agree with. His friend Marcus took a gentler approach. Over dinner one evening, with the straightforward honesty that Edward valued in him above most things, I like her, Marcus said. I want to say that first. I think she's extraordinary. But Cavendish, you are a public figure, whether you like it or not. What you do with your life is observed and commented upon and used, and she will be commented upon. She already is. Is that something you're prepared for? Is she? Edward said. Marcus looked at him. Have you asked her? He said. Not yet, Edward said. But I intend to. Which was true. He had been working towards something for weeks, circling it, approaching it from different angles, testing the edges of it. Not afraid, exactly. More the feeling of standing at a door that you know you are going to open, that you want to open, but that is significant enough that you want to be sure before you turn the handle. He was sure. He had been sure for some time. He simply wanted to be fair to the sureness, to give it the weight it deserved, rather than rushing at it. He also wanted, though he would not have said this to Marcus or anyone else, to be certain that she was sure too. That was the part that mattered more than any of the rest of it. He asked her on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, in the garden of the house where the Whitfield salon was held, after everyone else had gone home. This was not planned. The conversation had wandered, and most of the other guests had filtered out, and then all of the other guests had filtered out, and the afternoon was warm and golden, and the garden was quiet, and they were standing near the wall where someone had trained climbing roses in a way that made the whole corner smell like something you wanted to remember. He said her name. She turned toward him. The light was behind her. He said, I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to tell me what you actually think, not what you believe I want to hear. She said, when have I ever told you what you wanted to hear? He almost laughed. Never. That is one of the things I like most about you. A pause. She was watching him with her full attention, the way she listened at lectures, the way she had listened when he told her about his father. He said, I would like you to marry me. He said it simply and directly, without preamble or speech, because that was how she preferred things, and because it was also how he preferred things, and because the sentence was what it was, and adding words to it would only dilute it. She was quiet. The climbing roses moved slightly in a small breeze. Somewhere in the house behind them, a door closed. She was quiet for long enough that he began to understand something. Not that she would say no. He did not think she would say no, and he was not usually wrong about things he had thought carefully about. But he began to understand that the question was costing her something, that for all her directness, For all her refusal to be managed or arranged or made convenient, there was something in her that was cautious about this, that had reason to be cautious about this. She had trusted someone before. It had ended. Not badly. She did not speak of it with bitterness. But it had ended. And it had ended in a way that had sent her to Florence, for a year, to find out who she was underneath the debris of it. He waited. He did not rush her toward an answer. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time with those dark, evaluating eyes that had looked at him the first day with the same honest appraisal. "I should tell you," she said finally, "that I have been told a great deal about what it means to be married to a man in your position. The obligations, the visibility, the weight of a name that is 8 generations old." She paused. "My family has made very clear that this is not a small thing." "It is not a small thing," he agreed. "And I should tell you," she continued, "that I will not change. I know that women are expected to. I know there is a version of this where I become a more appropriate version of myself, more quiet, more managed, more convenient for the drawing rooms. I am not asking for that," he said. "You say that now." "Eleanor," he said, with a certainty that surprised even him, "I do not want a more appropriate version of you. I want the version that argued with Lord Ashworth and went to Florence and writes in the margins of books and told me I was wrong about Ricardo 3 separate times and was right all 3 times." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Her eyes were bright. "You want me to be difficult," she said. "I want you to be you," he said, "which is different from difficult, though I understand why people confuse them." Another silence. "But different from the first one. This one had a quality of decision in it, like a room where someone is about to open the window." "Yes," she said. One word. But she said it with her whole self, directly and without hesitation, and there was nothing in her face when she said it that suggested she was uncertain. The pause had been about cost counting. He understood. She had counted the cost and decided it was one she was willing to pay. That was the difference between someone who said yes without thinking and someone who said yes having thought entirely. He felt something settle in him, something that had been moving for a long time. "Good," he said. She laughed then, the real laugh, the helpless kind, at the understatement of it. And he laughed too. And the garden smelled like roses, and the afternoon was gold, and nobody was watching, and it was one of the best moments of his life. The reaction was, as anticipated, loud. Not universally. Marcus shook his hand and said, "I'm glad," and meant it. Several of Edward's closer friends offered genuine congratulations. Professor Whitfield and his wife were delighted, which gave Edward a pleasure out of proportion to their standing in his social world. But the other variety was also present, loudly. His mother did not speak to him for 11 days. This was not a comfortable 11 days. He missed her. They had always been close in the particular way that English families of their class were close. Not demonstratively, not with a great deal of articulated feeling, but with a consistent underlying current of genuine care that both of them knew was there, even when neither of them said so. On the 12th day she sent him a note, asking him to come to tea. He went. She was sitting in the chair by the window when he arrived, and she looked at him for a long moment when he came in, and he could see that she had been thinking about this for 11 days and had arrived somewhere. "Tell me about her," she said. Not an accusation, a genuine request. He told her. Not the version you tell people when you want to defend a choice. The real version, what Eleanor was, what talking to her was like, what it felt like to be in a room with someone who never pretended. He told his mother about the poor law argument, and the Florence year, and the birds in the park, and the way she had listened when he talked about his father's finances, and the things she had said about not wanting to mistake comfort for contentment. His mother listened. He had his father's ears, people said. He thought sometimes he had his mother's quality of listening. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She sounds, his mother said carefully, like someone who would be very difficult to live without. Yes, Edward said. She is. His mother nodded once. I see, she said. And then, bring her to tea on Thursday. She brought her to tea on Thursday, which was not how he had phrased it in his own mind, but was, he allowed, essentially accurate. Eleanor wore a dress that was entirely her own choice in the matter of what a dress could look like, and she shook his mother's hand with a directness that made his mother blink. And within 20 minutes they were arguing about agricultural reform, and his mother, who had spent 60 years developing opinions and had rarely found anyone willing to engage them at full strength, was leaning forward in her chair. He sat back and drank his tea and did not interfere. By the end of the hour, his mother had offered Eleanor more cake twice and had said, not quite directly, but close enough to be unmistakable, that she should come again. On the way out, Eleanor said to him quietly, "Your mother is formidable." "Yes," he said, "I like her." "She likes you," he said, which was not something his mother had said, but something he knew with certainty anyway. Eleanor looked at him sideways. "She told you that? She offered you cake twice. She thought about this. That's your evidence?" "She has never offered me cake twice," he said, "and I have known her for 31 years. Eleanor laughed. He took her hand. They walked out into the London afternoon, and he did not let go of her hand for the next 3 streets, and nobody died from the impropriety of it. The wedding was in September. People came. This was not surprising. They had always been going to come. The specific pleasure of a scandal is that you can attend it and disapprove of it simultaneously, which is a very efficient use of an afternoon. The church was full. The light was the particular amber color of September in London, coming through old windows, landing on old stone, and making everything look as though it existed slightly outside of time. His mother sat in the front row and held herself very straight, which was her version of emotional support. His uncle sat 3 rows back with an expression of resigned goodwill. His cousin James sat beside him and had the look of a man who had been wrong about something significant and was processing it quietly. Marcus sat near the middle and looked simply, genuinely pleased. Various members of the drawing rooms that had deemed Eleanor Voss an inappropriate choice sat in various positions and watched with the attention of people who have already decided what they think but cannot quite stop looking. He stood at the front of the church and waited. She came down the aisle with her father, who had the expression of a man who had spent many years being exhausted by his youngest daughter, and was currently, despite himself, proud of her. Her 2 sisters were bridesmaids and were both fine, as his mother had once described them, and were also visibly delighted in a way that fine people sometimes are when the extraordinary member of the family does something extraordinary. She was wearing a dress that was exactly what she wanted to wear, which was not precisely what the fashion suggested for a September wedding, but was entirely, undeniably right for her. Her hair was up, but not severely. She was not nervous. He could tell this from 20 feet away. The set of her shoulders, the quality of her walk, the fact that she was looking straight at him and not at the room. She looked at him the whole way down the aisle. He looked at her. The room, the amber light, the full pews, the historical weight of 8 generations of Cavendish weddings held in this church. All of it was present and accounted for and entirely irrelevant. There were 2 people in this church as far as he was concerned, and he was one of them and she was the other, and the distance between them was closing with every step she took. She reached him. Her father placed her hand in his with a formality that was also, underneath it, genuine. "Hello," she said quietly. "Hello," he said. They got married. The ceremony was the ceremony. Old words, good words, words that had been said in this church for a very long time. He said his portion and meant every word of it, with a completeness that surprised him, even though he had known he would. She said her portion and looked at him while she said it, with that direct brown gaze that saw him entirely and did not look away. When it was done and they walked back up the aisle through the watching room, she was holding his arm, and she leaned toward him briefly and said, just for him, "Your uncle looks like he's revising his opinions." He glanced without turning his head. His uncle did, in fact, look like a man in the process of reluctant reconsideration. "Good," Edward said. "It won't last," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. "Doesn't matter," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They walked out into the September afternoon and into the rest of their lives. The life they built did not look like any of the predictions. This seems like it should be a dramatic thing to say. It is not. It is simply accurate. London waited for the trouble to begin. It checked in periodically over the following months and years, the way people check on something they expect to collapse, waiting for the satisfaction of confirmation. The trouble did not come. What came instead was a household that operated on unusual terms. Eleanor did not become the Duchess of Cavendish in the sense that most people meant when they used that phrase. A title that smoothed off the edges of a person and fitted them into the shape the role required. She was herself, with the title added to the existing situation rather than replacing it. She continued her views on factory conditions. She continued attending lectures and writing in the margins of books and saying things at dinner tables that made certain guests uncomfortable and certain other guests feel, for the first time in months, that they were having a real conversation. She became involved in a project supporting the education of working-class children in 2 of the poorer districts of the city, which she ran with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything. No sentimentality, no performance of goodness, just the actual work of identifying what needed to be done and doing it. She made friends. Not the friends that were strategically useful or socially recommended, but the friends she found genuinely interesting. Whitfield and his wife, a journalist named Frances who had been one of the few women in that profession in London. A doctor named Marsh who had trained abroad because British medical schools had not been accommodating, and others in that general direction. People who were doing things that mattered, and who found Eleanor's combination of intelligence and directness as refreshing as she found theirs. Some of London came around. His mother came around entirely, which nobody had predicted, and Edward believed it happened because his mother had spent 60 years having opinions, and Eleanor was the first person she had encountered who had opinions of comparable quality and equal willingness to defend them. They argued about everything. They clearly loved it. He occasionally came home to find them in the sitting room, deep in disagreement about something, and they would both look up at him with the expressions of people who had been interrupted, and he would quietly get himself a drink and leave them to it. His uncle came around partially, in the way that constitutes the most honest form of coming around. Not with stated enthusiasm, but with the gradual abandonment of resistance, until after a year or two, he was simply treating Eleanor with the straightforward respect he treated people he found valuable. His cousin James took longer. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man for whom the existing order was important because he had always lived comfortably inside it. But he had a daughter, as it turned out, who was developing her own opinions about things, and who had begun, by the time she was 14, to cite Eleanor as someone whose example she intended to follow. James found this simultaneously alarming and, as the years went on, increasingly difficult to argue with. The drawing rooms that had predicted disaster were obliged, over time, to either avoid the subject or develop more nuanced positions on it. And most of them, being people who enjoyed having positions, eventually developed the nuanced positions. Not everyone. There was a subset of London society for whom Eleanor would always be the wrong choice in the wrong place, and they held this position with the consistency of people who have made their personality out of a conviction and cannot easily separate themselves from it. She did not mind. They were welcome to it. She had other things to do. He watched all of this over the years and felt something that was difficult to name, because it was several things simultaneously. Pride was part of it. He was proud of her constantly, a pride that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with the specific pleasure of watching someone you love be exactly who they are, fully and without apology, in a world that had spent considerable energy suggesting they should be something else. Gratitude was part of it, for what she had done to him, not dramatically but structurally. She had opened the windows of his life, and the air was different now, and he could not have gone back to the closed window version, even if he had wanted to. But the largest part of what he felt, the thing underneath the others, was simpler than either of those. It was the thing you feel when you are in the right place. Not happiness in the momentary sense, not excitement, not the feeling of having gotten away with something. Just rightness. The steady, deep sense that the location of your life is correct. That you are where you are supposed to be, with who you are supposed to be with, doing what you are supposed to be doing. He felt this on ordinary mornings over breakfast. He felt it in the middle of arguments about politics. He felt it when she came home from one of her project meetings, with paint on her sleeve, and a story about something that had gone wrong in a funny way, and he sat and listened to the whole thing, and then pointed out the thing she had already noticed was funny, and she laughed, and he thought, yes. Here. This. They had children. 3 of them. A girl first, and then a boy, and then another girl, and the children grew up in a house that was unusual, in the specific ways that a house is unusual, when the people in it have decided to be honest with each other. They argued in front of the children, which certain visitors found alarming, because the children needed to know that disagreement was not a threat to love. The arguments were not cruel. They were genuine, about ideas, about decisions, about the running of the household and the estate, and the 1,000 small choices that constitute a life lived together. And they resolved, or they didn't resolve, and were set aside until they did. And the children watched and learned that 2 people could be angry with each other and still love each other, and that this was not a contradiction. The eldest daughter inherited her mother's directness and her father's patience, and was, by the age of 12, formidable in ways that her teachers found either inspiring or deeply inconvenient, depending on their temperament. The boy was quieter and more interior, and had a talent for mathematics that neither of his parents had, and spent long hours doing calculations on paper in the manner of someone working through a private conversation with the universe. The youngest daughter was funny, sharply, quietly funny, in a way that didn't announce itself. She would say something perfectly ordinary, and then something else that arrived at the end of the ordinary thing, like a door opening onto an unexpected view. Edward noticed this and said nothing about it to Eleanor for 3 weeks, letting it accumulate, and then one evening at dinner, the youngest said something that made them all laugh, and he looked at Eleanor across the table, and she looked back at him, and she knew what he was thinking, and he knew she knew, and they didn't say it out loud, because they didn't need to. He was 64 when a young man named Thomas Hartley came to see him. Thomas was the son of an acquaintance, 26 years old, engaged to be married to a woman that several members of his family had expressed concern about. Not identical concerns to the ones Edward's family had expressed 33 years earlier. The particulars were different, but the structure was recognizable. She was unconventional. She had opinions. She did not fit the expected shape. Thomas had heard, through some chain of acquaintances, that the Duke of Cavendish had once been in a similar position. He came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon with the slightly formal manner of a young man who is not sure if he is doing the right thing by being here and has decided to be here anyway. Eleanor was out. At a meeting. The house was quiet. Edward brought him into the sitting room and had tea sent up, and looked at this young man who was carrying the particular expression of someone who has been told by everyone he loves that the person he loves is wrong for him. He knew that expression. He had seen it in mirrors. "What did they say?" Edward asked. Thomas blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The people who warned you. What did they say, specifically?" Thomas thought. "That she's too much. That she'll make life complicated. That she's not appropriate." He said the last word with a careful absence of expression. "And what do you think?" "I think they're wrong," Thomas said. And then, with the honesty of a young man who has not yet learned to be strategic about honesty, "I'm afraid they might be right." Edward looked at him. He thought about what to say. He thought about 33 years of breakfast tables and arguments and climbing roses and Florence and Edinburgh and a daughter who was formidable and a son who talked to the universe and a youngest child who was funny in the quietest possible way. He thought about his mother, who had become Eleanor's fiercest advocate by the end, who had told him in her last year that meeting Eleanor was the best thing that had happened to the family in 2 generations. He thought about what he would say to his own younger self, if that were possible, standing outside his mother's house in the afternoon sun, feeling like a window that had just been opened. "They told me I'd regret it," Edward said. Thomas looked at him. "My mother, my uncle." Various well-meaning people with various well-meaning arguments. Edward paused. They were very thorough about it. He said nothing else for a moment. The afternoon light came through the sitting room windows, the same amber color it had been coming through windows for as long as he could remember. "Did you?" Thomas asked finally. "Regret it?" Edward picked up his tea. He thought about the question with the same honesty he had always tried to bring to important things. "There were difficult years," he said. "There are difficult years in every marriage that has 2 real people in it. We disagreed about things. There were periods when we did not understand each other as well as we do now. There were social costs, for both of us, things we were not invited to, doors that stayed closed, opinions that were spoken in our hearing by people who should have known better." He set the cup down. "All of that is true." Thomas waited. "But regret," Edward said, "requires that you can imagine the alternative being better. And I cannot. I have tried, sometimes, in the way you try to imagine a road not taken, a door not opened. And the alternative is simply less. A smaller life, a quieter life. A life with more approval from people whose approval turned out not to matter very much." He looked at Thomas. "The people who warned me were not cruel," he said. "Most of them loved me, in their way. They were afraid of disruption. They were afraid of what happened to the name, the title, the established order of things. They were afraid, most fundamentally, of her, of what she was, of how she refused to be managed, of the fact that she could not be made to be convenient." He paused. "She was never convenient. She is not convenient now, and I would not change a single year of it." Thomas was quiet for a long time. "How did you know?" he said finally. "That she was, how did you know it wasn't just infatuation?" Edward said. "Yes." He thought about this honestly. "She said something to me once," he said, "early on, before I had decided anything. She said she was afraid of mistaking comfort for contentment, of choosing the safe thing so many times that she stopped noticing it was a choice. He looked at the window. I recognized that fear. I had been living inside a version of it for years, without naming it. And when she named it, when someone else said the exact thing that had been sitting in me without language, I understood that I was in the presence of someone I would not find again. He looked back at Thomas. That is not infatuation, he said. Infatuation is about the surface of someone. Recognition is about their interior. When you meet someone whose interior matches yours in a real way, you know. Not with certainty. There is no certainty in these things. But with enough. With more than enough. Thomas looked at him steadily. Your wife, he said. Would she? Is she? She is remarkable, Edward said simply. She has been remarkable since the morning I met her, and she has not stopped, and I do not expect her to. Thomas nodded. He looked at his hands. He looked up. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Edward said. Go home. Talk to her. Not about what other people think. About what you think. About what she thinks. The opinions are where you find out whether it's real. Thomas stood. He shook Edward's hand. He had arrived with the expression of someone who is not sure he is doing the right thing, and he left with the expression of someone who has decided. Edward watched him go from the window. The young man walked down the street with a purpose that had not been there before. He was still standing there when he heard the front door open, and Eleanor's voice in the hall, talking to the butler about something. There was an edge of amusement in her voice, which meant the meeting had produced something worth telling him about. He could tell from 20 feet away, through a closed door, which was the particular knowledge that 33 years builds in a person. He turned from the window. The room was amber-colored in the late afternoon light. Somewhere upstairs, his youngest daughter was almost certainly saying something quietly devastating to someone, and his son was almost certainly doing calculations. And the house had the sound of itself, slightly too loud, entirely alive, nothing like what a house was supposed to sound like in the estimation of various people who had various estimations. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. He did not go to meet her. She would find him. She always did. Instead, he stood in the amber room and waited, and listened to the sound of the house, and thought about Thomas Hartley walking down the street, toward his own version of this, and felt. The word he always came back to was right. He felt right. In his bones, in the structure of his days, in the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon at 64, when the light is amber, and the house is alive, and the person you chose is coming up the stairs. She opened the door. She saw him at the window, and she read his face, the way she had been reading it for 33 years. And she said, "You have that expression." "What expression?" "The one where something has happened, and you're deciding how to tell me about it." He smiled. "A young man came to see me." "About?" "A warning he had received." She came into the room and sat down in the chair that was, by now, simply her chair, the one by the good lamp. And she looked at him with those brown eyes that had been looking at him since a Thursday afternoon at the Royal Institute, and had not, in all that time, looked anywhere but directly. "What did you tell him?" she said. He thought about what he had told Thomas Hartley, about the difficult years that had been worth it, about the smaller life he had not been able to imagine choosing, about the recognition that was different from infatuation, about the word right, which was the only word that covered all of it. "The truth," he said. She was quiet a moment. She had that expression she got sometimes, the one that was not quite a smile, but was the thing underneath a smile, the private and real precursor to it. "Did he believe you?" she said. "I think so," Edward said. He had the look. "What look?" "The one where someone has stopped counting the costs," he said, "and started counting everything else." She was quiet again. The room was amber. Somewhere in the house, a door opened, and the youngest daughter's voice came up through the floor, saying something to the cat in a tone of completely unwarranted formality that made the cat, as the youngest daughter had correctly identified, more likely to cooperate. Eleanor laughed, the real kind, the helpless kind. He laughed too. Then the laugh settled, and they were quiet together in the amber room, in the house that was too loud and entirely alive, in the life that had not looked like any of the predictions. And he thought about the warnings, all of them, every careful and concerned and well-meaning voice that had told him what he would feel, what would happen, what he would become on the other side of this choice. They had been very thorough about it. He had never done it. He had never, on a single afternoon of a single year of 33 years, looked at the woman sitting in the chair by the good lamp, or at the house they had built together, or at the children they had raised, or at the things they had argued about, and the things they had laughed at, and the things they had both been afraid of and walked toward anyway. He had never looked at any of it and felt the word regret. Not even approaching it, not even in the vicinity. There was no version of the life where he had listened to the warnings that he could hold in his mind without something in him going very quiet and very still and very certain that it would have been the wrong life entirely. He had been told he would regret marrying her. He was 64 years old. He sat down across from her in his chair, in the amber light, in the right place, and he never had.